So we have Stacy Pearson, WSU's Chief Financial Officer and VP for Finance and Administration. She's going to provide us with an overview of the university's budget during COVID-19 and actions taken to stabilize. So thank you, Stacy, for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really glad to be here. I actually have some PowerPoint to share, if that's okay. And I will attempt to do so. I can try to go to full screen. I have limited luck. The only thing I hate about full screen is I can't see chat. So I would encourage you to interrupt me, or and you'll have to do it verbally, because again, maybe I can see the hand raised, but sometimes I can't when I'm doing a presentation. So feel free. I won't be offended at all. And then of course I'll leave some time for questions at the end in addition. Okay.
Great. And Stacy, I'll watch the chat for you as well with any questions.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So I put it on slideshow. I don't know if it's going to go to full slideshow or not, but we'll see. We can probably make do with this if that's okay, though, just so I can get going. And I'll start with first thanking all of you. This has just been a year, hasn't it? We thought it was challenging before, and we come into this year with starting last spring. Can you believe it's almost been a year since we made the announcement that students weren't returning in March? So it's about 11 months. And then everything that just ensued after that, everything from testing to remote delivery and, the challenges, and we were going to open, but then we decided we weren't going to open. All of you adjusting to remote work, and oh my goodness, you don't have good enough internet. What are we going to do about that? And then modernization on top of all of that, right? Which I know many people have been impacted by and still are being. So I just want to say, in my career, and it's been a long one in higher ed, I won't give you how many years, but let's just say over 30, this is truly the most significant impact of any of the, not just from a budget standpoint, just from things I was reflecting, things that we thought we'd never do. You'd never even think of considering that you're not going to come to campus, or, all of these things. I'm pretty proud of how we've adjusted to it. And believe me, there have been so many challenges. I know each of you have experienced that, but just in the decision making and trying to do the right thing, and one day making a decision that everybody was critical of, and the next day it turned out to be a good decision. Who knew? So we really struggle through this, both when we meet with our regents, when we're speaking with students, and just appreciate the patience. But I know there's also a lot of anxiety that goes along with this. So I just wanted to say that before I got started on this. First of all, I wanted to just remind you that, we were already dealing with kind of a fiscal crisis situation, in that we were operating in deficit. And we started in fiscal year 17 with a 3-year fiscal recovery plan. I know most of you are very familiar with that. So we achieved that, which is great, because when we went into COVID, I'll tell you, if we had been in the same position as we were in fiscal year 17, it would be very grim indeed. It's grim enough the way it is, but it would have been even worse. My staff and I are working on a FY21 integrated financial forecast tools that we're using to kind of, look at all the considerations, both from the revenue standpoint and expense standpoint, and identifying financial strategies and tools to help us not only deal with the current year, but really we're focused on the next biennium at this point. And I'll just tell you, there remains to be a lot of unknown, but there's good news and continuing concerning news. Just a reminder about this, because this graphic is pretty significant to show that overall university-wide, we were kind of steadily operating in this deficit. And then our goal was to improve that $30 million deficit by $10 million a year. And look at what we did. We actually greatly exceeded that. So that was FY20. Now remember, COVID hit that last quarter of FY20. So how were we able to achieve this? This is for the year ending June 30. So we were 3 months into the COVID situation. Well, what happened was the federal funds and some of the state funds, but in particular the CARES Act, enabled us to cover some of those revenue losses from all of the housing refunds and dining refunds, as well as help us cover some of the expenses that that we needed to cover to move to remote delivery, Chromebooks, additional tools for faculty. Some of this is in testing and things. So we did get through that year very well. But this is a cash impact analysis, and this darker orange line up here shows that how the recovery was really helping our cash position from the past. These lines here are kind of what the impact of COVID is. So you can see it's really having that wreaking that havoc as we look ahead, and we need this to keep going up, not go down. So this is what we're focused on addressing, among many other things. So what we did is, when I say integrated financial planning and forecasting, what that means is you're doing a best, worst, middle case analysis. We actually looked at about 5 scenarios of, everything from state funding going way down, because remember last spring, the state announced our 10% budget reductions for the current fiscal year, that is fiscal year 21, as well as the next biennium. For WSU, that was about 37 million. So that's pretty impactful. So we had that announcement in May. And then, of course, we were dealing with the fact that over that summer, we're making that decision. We were hoping to come back in person. And then in July, made the decision that we would be doing remote delivery for the fall. Obviously, that impacted our enrollments, particularly for freshmen, because freshmen were faced with do I want to start my academic career like this? Probably with the thought too that maybe by spring things would be better and or be back in person and that type of thing. And then in about, now I can't remember, it was late October, early November when we announced that spring would be remote. Again, that does impact the enrollments, which then impacts tuition revenues. Now that we've got our spring enrollments, the decline wasn't on the worst end of that analysis that we did. Our enrollments are down a bit. They're down more in certain areas like transfers and freshmen, but it wasn't as deep of a reduction. So I can report that today that we will now go back and adjust this plan because we'll have a full year of our enrollments to kind of predict what the rest of the year will look like. And as far as the state appropriation, the legislature is meeting now. If they will take any actions on the current year budget, well, time's, running out. We're about 4.5 months left in the current fiscal year. So we're just staying with the current year plan that we had. So we did those budget reductions, went into effect last summer. We asked people to plan for an additional 2 years, again, based on what the state had indicated to us. Our hope is, and hopefully, I'm sure all of you have been following the news, is that the state's revenues won't be as, dire as they were predicted last summer. And so as that sorts itself out, we may see adjustments, certainly for the next biennium for us to do planning on. But it's just, without having that concrete information, it's best to be conservative. So staying the course for the rest of this fiscal year, and then watching very carefully for next fiscal year. And then again, all of these are included in our financial forecasting, our enrollment financial aid and waiver planning. Athletics, certainly. Athletics has been hit extremely hard with this, with the COVID situation. And as you know, they were on a fiscal recovery plan also that basically had them coming out of deficit, annual deficit spending, by fiscal year 22. And they were actually achieving that improvement as they went. But this year, with football games canceled and bowl games canceled, it's definitely declined. So we're looking at, based on, they've been updating their budget monthly, as well as working with the Pac-12. It's directly connected, because anytime games or bowls are canceled, that's less revenue that comes into the athletics programs. So that's going to be a major area of concern. And of course, we're working on a longer term fiscal recovery plan, but understanding that we still have to get through this year, and depending on what happens with basketball, that will impact that budget. And then what happens, how do we budget for the next fiscal year 22? Do we budget assuming that everything's back to normal? That's difficult to, really assess, but we'll continue to watch that and make adjustments as we go. And then certainly sponsored research revenue, salary planning, meaning, that we haven't planned for any salary increases. Capital investments, the state capital budget being proposed is a pretty solid one. So, hopefully that can go forward. And then, of course, really leveraging our fundraising and advancement activities to help, not just with student scholarships, but even with our operating budget. So those are some of the considerations. So again, COVID-19 pandemic is bringing, as we've already know, those unprecedented economic changes and challenges. So I've been meeting very regular, actually, with my Pac-12 colleagues who are also finance officers, as well as groups that have many of the schools in the West, including Montana, Nevada, New Mexico. And, everybody is having this experience. So when we looked at our latest forecasts, it suggests that our revenue loss could be as much as 60 to 80 million. Why the uncertainty? Because we're still in the middle of the fiscal year. And like I mentioned to you, a lot of that is in the athletics department, but it's also in housing and dining. Some of that is reflective of lower of our budget reduction, as well as lower tuition revenues that we're impacting. So we continue to update this. And again, having the spring enrollments enables us to now go through an update for that condition, as well as any actions that the legislature might take. So how can we mitigate these losses? This additional state and federal emergency funds, really good news on that front. With the federal package that was passed very late in 2020, the university, I should mention, in the CARES funding that we received in last fiscal year was just shy of 22 million. And of course, half of that went to student aid, emergency student aid. So I mentioned to you earlier that really helped us finish fiscal year 20 in a good financial position. So like many of you, we waited with bated breath to see what would happen in the fall with any additional federal funding. And lo and behold, at the very end of that year, that came through, and that represented about 34 million for WSU. And again, we needed to award at least as much as we did before for student emergency aid. So we are right now just going through, how those funds can be used. I would say this: the focus is really on revenue loss related to COVID and expenditures that you had to cover. So this isn't the ability to, do anything new with these funds. And we want to be careful to follow all of the rules about how we spend it, but we will have plenty of expenses that can be covered with that. And so we're just kind of sorting through, making sure that we match those expenses up with, with the language in the legislation. And then there's some good news on the forefront with the latest package from the Biden administration, which early estimates indicate could be in the neighborhood of 61 million for Washington State University, and it appears that half of that will need to go to emergency student aid. So if you do the math, you see that's not going to quite cover, the if we have 60 to 80 million. And let me be very clear, a large part of that is athletics. Currently, what we're anticipating is probably 30 million. You can't use those federal funds to cover the athletics deficit. So that's something that we have to manage ourselves. So when I'm going to go down to the savings from debt refunding, one action that we did take was to refund eligible debt, which basically means we have some of the debt at the university that is eligible for refinancing, just like many of you may have refinanced your home mortgage because of the good rates. And so we basically did the refunding, but instead of passing those savings on to each of those areas that were paying the debt, we just put the cash, we parked it because we're in an emergency situation. So we just parked it until we can kind of get through the year and see how we're going to do. And then this point about restructuring of existing debt or new financing options to produce cash liquidity. So that's something that honestly is really quite a first for many of my colleagues and I to think about. Would we actually issue debt for operating? We issue debt for capital. We're pretty used to that when we're going to build things. But to issue it for operating is a really serious question. And you know why. I mean, if you're going to borrow for your, daily expenses, now you've got a new expense to pay that off. And so I mention that just because it's something that all of many institutions are considering. And it's because of these amazing rates that they can borrow at. But it makes people like myself, and I'm sure many of you, really nervous to think about doing that. That's kind of a last resort. And I'll tell you why. We would need to extend our debt service. All of our debt is paid off by 2039 if we kept on the current schedule. And so, that's kind of within a range that you can see. But in order to do this, it would probably require extending that. Would we extend our debt service out another 10 years and then find the money to pay that debt service? So that's a pretty serious consideration. We've got it. It's one of the financial tools. So we've got it in there looking at it. And it particularly relates to athletics, as in if we're going to figure out how we get through the current year deficit as well as their longer term recovery, is that a mechanism that we're going to need to use? The Pac-12 has put forth a proposal of basically providing a debt structure in which the repayment would come from reduced media revenues to athletics. So it would impact their budget they would just get less revenue in order to repay this. We're not quite sure yet whether that's going to work because of some of the conditions, but it just gives you a little bit of insight into tools that we're looking at that believe me, a year ago, this was not even on our radar that we would do something like that. I'll pause there for just a minute to see if there's any questions. This is just an illustration of that debt issuance. This blue line is we basically took that savings and we parked it to help us deal with emergencies. And then this is the new money debt service. And when we did this one, we were very careful to say, we're not going to increase the annual debt service payment, and we're not going to extend our debt. And this actually has it going out to 2041, but that was for a different structure than the one that we just refinanced. So you can see that that's just a strategy, and it says we're setting that cash aside for emergencies. A piece of good news is because of the fiscal recovery, we were able to retain our Moody's rating, which is an AA3 for Moody's and an A+ for S&P. And that shows strong fiscal health. And it's a significant accomplishment because if, when we were spending in deficit, that was at risk. And then to be able to recover and have this rating stay in October of 20, knowing what we were going to experience. But they did give us a warning. And again, this figures into our long-term planning efforts, is they did commend us on the successful and structured effort to improve our reserve levels, and that it did provide us some ability to offset the significant revenue loss. They are telling us, and this is something we knew and that we've been talking about, that we need to grow our reserves, that is our liquidity, so that we have a savings account that we can use versus having to borrow. And obviously, they recommend that we recover and improve our operating performance in like enrollment, housing, and athletics. That's an obvious one. We'd all like that. And this continued concern they expressed of our low resources kind of relative to our peers, so that even with the fiscal recovery, and just to remind you, the second phase of our fiscal recovery was to build reserves. Many of you know that we've asked colleges and departments to not spend their carry forward, because that's how you build reserves, is as you keep that money available. And so after the fiscal recovery, we were hoping to build those reserves, but also ease up on that holding of carry forward funds, because people did a great job during the recovery of doing that. And we had hoped to, quote, reward with the ability to spend some percentage of that. I want to remind you, though, we did allow for about 5% of outstanding carry forward balances to be used toward that 10% budget reduction. We did recognize how difficult that was going to be. So we did allow for that. And again, that's just, we keep analyzing the data to see how can we help the best that we can, but how can we also be maybe looking forward to saying this might not be over yet. And so, again, this comment they've put in nearly all of the institutions' rating reports, is that this is a significant risk in our sector, and particularly related to, because nobody ever anticipated that you wouldn't have residential hall revenues and dining revenues, those types of things. Hopefully you can see this, because it's kind of blocked by some of the things, but basically it's just a repeat that the considerations of the federal and state emergency funding, because that, as I indicated, those amounts of funds really will help us in this current fiscal year. And then what I just talked to you about, debt, carefully analyzed, it creates additional debt service. So I view this as kind of a last resort, but honestly, it might have to be one that we consider, for athletics to get us through the year, probably this year, next. And again, this comment, I dropped the one here, I apologize, that the economic impacts are likely to extend beyond fiscal year 21. And so this federal and state aid, really, we can leverage it to assist with longer term recovery. And what I mean by that, not that we're going to use it for, future programs, but covering those expenses, that means that we can, maybe use our current operating budget, for how we, and let me give you an example of what that might mean is, we have lower freshman student numbers, enrollment numbers. So we want to make sure that we invest some money to encourage freshmen and transfers to come in the fall. So we're watching those application rates, applications for fall very, very carefully. So how can we use some of our own funds, some of our private funds, to really encourage students to come to WSU and come in the fall. As you know, we've announced that we plan to be in person in the fall, and we did that very purposely because that is what students really want, and we know that. And now we feel like we have enough experience to, quote, how to do it safely. Obviously, we're relying a lot on vaccination, but we're also saying, we might not be planning for large lecture hall classes. in the fall. Some of those we might go to that hybrid online or how to use our spaces better, because our primary concern is keeping our faculty and staff safe, and of course our students, but to also get them back to the educational experience that they really desire. And that is going to be tricky, and it's going to mean that using these federal funds to make sure that we're prepared, that we can open in a safe manner for students to return, and that we can consider, well, we've got some time now, so how can we make sure that that experience is a good one? We've learned a lot from our fall and spring experience, and we've also learned how resilient our faculty and staff are, because this has just been a huge undertaking. And so we want to do it right, we want to do it safely, but we also want students to feel comfortable coming to WSU, and not just our new students. Our enrollment rates on our continuing students have been pretty good, but I can assure you this is not the experience that they were hoping to have, although many have reported that they've done okay in some of the classes. And so I think what we look at this is, when you see this one note, short and long-term cost structure adjustments will be needed. We're trying to learn from this situation to say, is there, will we do more online delivery in the future? Our global campus is doing very well. I think many faculty are seeing that maybe the combination of in-person and some courses delivered online, or some portions hybrid structure, that we should learn from that. We also sit on a task force that is chaired by Senator Hunt, that is statewide, looking how this changes our work environment. In other words, in your offices, you may return when we return in person. Some of you may still work remotely. Maybe it's just some days. Obviously it has to align with the work that needs to be done at the university, but we're all looking at that as how can this be beneficial? Of course, it's very impacted by public schools and daycares, right? Because it's one thing to say, well, you would return to work, but the children need to be in school and be able to have daycare before we can do that. But maybe this is an opportunity to offer some flexibility to our employees, that you might not have liked everything about this, but maybe there were some advantages. And so I think Senator Hunt and others have said, hey, let's think about this. If you think about what can we learn from this? I know in our Seattle office, we're, quote, hoteling, meaning that you don't necessarily have an office, but you have a place to work, because a lot of the people there already, work remotely. And so we're really trying to look at that and seeing how we can maybe even reduce our space footprint in places like Seattle, where we do pay quite a bit in lease expense. But also in other places, how can we reuse our space or use it better to both enhance the work environment, but make sure that we're providing the services that are needed? So I guess the saying is don't waste a good crisis. And this is one of those. And we're not the only state and agency looking at this. This is a kind of a big, a big conversation across the country and across our industry is, how will we leverage this? We made some investments, right, so that we can improve how we do this. And can that be a good experience for students? And can it be a good experience for our faculty and staff? And so I'm sure you're going to be asked for some input, as to how that works. I know in my own division, we're kind of having that discussion about, how does it work? When does it work? It would be different for different offices and that type of thing.
Stacy, this is Jenny Glass out in Puyallup.
Yes.
I've worked for WSU for 2 decades now. And one of the things that I am frustrated, well, first of all, let me start with what I'm grateful for. I am grateful for the flexibility to, be able to figure out family and home life in this pandemic. 3 or 4 years ago, I needed to stay home for 2 hours a night because my middle school kid was in trouble, and there was just no way that the team would work with me for that. And so, it was very, very frustrating. So if that could be changed because of how we've all dealt with this together, awesome. But what you just asked about input, and I'm wondering, who are we asking when you talk about these savings things? Like, for example, in order to do my job from home, I had to get a higher internet bandwidth, right? I could not do it from the almost dial-up I was having. I paid for that. I have not had a cost of living raise really in a long, long time. I mean, we've gotten a few little increments, but I make less money today than I did when I started 20 years ago, if you really consider it. We at Puyallup, our budgets are balanced because other people do the work that somebody else used to do. I was having computer problems yesterday. There is no IT person, that just could come and help me out. I mean, there are people that can do it over the internet and stuff like that. But I have to problem shoot for an hour before I, got to that stage. And that's a waste of my time because I don't have that skill set. So I'm just, sorry, very long-winded, but just wondering how much the university administration is considering the things that the people like myself and other members of this committee have to take on in order to make the university budget work.
No, I appreciate that. And I definitely sense your frustration. I mean, I couldn't fix my own internet either if I had to do that, and to have somebody to call that can walk you through that, and to have, how do you get enhanced internet service when you're working from home? And admittedly, I would say that hasn't been addressed consistently, and part of that is because of the budget. So we did try to tell managers and supervisors that, you should do what you can to offer, what are they called? Like the MiFis to help with internet. It doesn't help in every cases, but it can help in a lot of cases. And then, things we did for students like the parking lot Wi-Fi. Well, that's not going to help when you're an employee trying to work from home. So we understand that. But I think that that's the type of input, and then we need to deal with that, because I would say that if we can use those federal funds to help, if that's one of the expenses that we decide that we need to cover, while that's happening. But then again, we need, if this is more of a longer term thing, we need to address that in a long-term manner. Like, how would those expenses be supported? So I do suspect that it was maybe inconsistently applied depending on, what area you were in, but that's because likely of the budget reductions. And so I think that we'll take that to heart as we look at these federal funds and what we can, and state funds, what they can be used to cover, and hopefully try to alleviate some of that. So we will welcome your input in that, and see if we can insert that into some policies. Obviously, we have to think about, remote work. That's going to require some type of guidance and policy. Right now, we're just kind of, well, pretty much the order is we're not working in the office. Many of you probably gone in the office. I certainly have. We've done the attestation. We make sure that there's only, so many people in there. But as we, that's not available to everyone. And so I hope that the good that comes out of this is that additional flexibility. But you're bringing up the point, then we also maybe have to have some fiscal support for that type of structure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think you might also know we established an executive budget council, which is co-chaired by myself and the provost, and it's really to address many things. It was in the works anyway, to do that, to look at the university's budget model, but also kind of aligned with our new strategic plan, which of course is very focused on how are we going to operate on a system. And I think Anna mentioned earlier, there's some white papers out there. I think a lot of people might look at this as, oh no, more change. I do think that we're probably in an industry that is going to undergo change, and not just because of COVID, but there's other competition out there for students. There's also what's considered the 2025 enrollment drop, which is just because nationally, on average, there will be less students graduating from high school. Those statistics aren't as, they're actually better in the Northwest and in Washington. That is not predicted to drop very much. However, there's going to be more competition for those students. So kind of leveraging, you know, what is it that our brand has to offer to attract students to Washington State University, and then what are some of those, you know, flexible hybrid type courses that may be attractive to students. So that means that we need to think about not just how we operate as a system, you know, that we do so effectively, but most importantly, to provide the best opportunities for our students. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of the discussion since I've been at WSU has been around a student should be able to come into WSU anywhere, the Vancouver campus, online, Pullman campus, and take whatever courses they want to take without having to be concerned that it's at this campus or that campus, you know. And what I've been told is not just told, but, you know, kind of bears out that, well, it's our budget model that, you know, it's the campus doesn't want to lose the tuition, so they won't encourage the student necessarily to take whatever they want. And so it's really along that, how do we deliver education to students and make it the best experience for them as possible? Some of them are place bound, some of them are going to be facing moves because of jobs. How do we make sure that they stay with us and that they come to us in the first place because we offer that flexibility? So that really is what that new budget model is about, is first of all, and I think this would, many of you would appreciate that, I don't think we've ever, it's at least from what I was able to tell, is there was never an all funds budget, which is you have more than your appropriated funds in your tuition. There are other revenue sources. How do we address our budget holistically? And then how do we make sure that there's a base budget that covers what everybody needs to operate, and then there's incentives to grow that budget. And you grow it in different ways, but certainly attracting students to WSU, attracting them to programs. And how can that budget model also encourage collaboration versus something that we keep hearing is, oh, well, we can't do that because of the budget model, as in somebody might not get their share of the pie. And institutions, systems resolve this all the time because they know that, you know, what you want is to bring students into the university so that our overall enrollment grows. And then you want to incentivize our very talented faculty and staff to identify, you know, what new programs that are going to really attract students or really appeal to, you know, to the companies that would hire these students. So working with industry on that. And also working with our donors to say, hey, look at our students are successful, they're getting jobs, that type of thing. So it's really, we're saying we've got a budget model, kind of. It's been in place a long time. The observation is we just kind of pile things on top of it, like a new program here and a new program there. It's extremely complicated to explain because there are, quote, special deals everywhere. At one point in time, we counted like 27 special deals, meaning, oh, I'll start this program if I get this much of the revenue. So we really want to say, wait, we've got a new strategic plan about how to operate as a system. A budget model should always support, a budget model and process should always support a strategic plan. So how are we going to do that? And so it's been an interesting conversation so far. Right now, where we are is we're listening to some experts who have helped implement budget models at other systems across the country, public university systems, kind of hearing the pros and cons. Kind of the benefit of doing this at this point is a lot of schools have done this and they've kind of seen some of the, oh yeah, don't do that, it didn't work out this way. So we've got a lot of, quote, best practices to choose from. The hard work is we've got to choose who we want to be and how we want to operate and deliver education, and then kind of identify those, you know, that budget model and the incentives to support that. And that can scare a lot of people because they think new budget model, that just means big budget cut. Well, not necessarily. It's how can we be effective in delivering and using our budget, to deliver what we need to do. And I'll also say this, very seldom, I've done a new budget model at a previous institution that I worked at, but generally you come up with these plans because you think you know what the outcome will be and what you want it to do. Then you live with it for a while and you say, oh, wait, there's a few unintended consequences there. We need to adjust for that. You also don't do it all in 1 year. You might start some key principles 1 year, see how it works, phase it in, if you will. And the other thing is you have to think of things like, we call it stop loss, where nobody's going to lose more than a certain amount of money, and that you keep a kind of a, keep it from, going too low, having anybody too negatively impacted at one point in time, but you still push that here's the incentives to help you grow your budget. And so I think it can be a very positive thing. And I would also say, if you really think about the WSU model now, it's kind of, you get what you got last year, plus or minus. And if the state offered, salary money, then you might get some of that. And so this is more to say, we got to make investments, for the long-term success of WSU, but we also have to pay attention to cost efficiencies and things like that. And so I think it's a very positive thing, but I also know that in my experience, generally, when people hear that, they're not always that enthusiastic. Everybody would like more money, but I think we also have to care about the long-term health of the institution and that we're doing the things that cause people to want to invest in us, our donors, that our students want to come here and that our employees want to work here. So those are a lot of considerations. So that's really what we're trying to do with this model. And that, we've just barely gotten started. So there's more to come. So this year we'll, coming into the biennium, we'll do a budget. There may be some impact of a new budget model, maybe not. We're still focused pretty much on recovery at this point. So, I just wanted to share that with you.
Great. Thanks, Stacy. We do have a couple people with their hands raised for questions. Maria, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Good morning. So I kind of wanted to go back a little bit on what Jenny had mentioned earlier regarding the support and need that AP staff need throughout the state. As there are extension AP workers all over, and there are other campus employees that are doing this job that have completely had to restructure their life and their home so that we can continue to support and have a job and support WSU at the same time. But Stacy, you had mentioned that the message had been inconsistent across the campus, across the institution. And so I'm wondering, what and how can that message be consistent in order to support everybody? Here comes a question regarding equity. So how can we support our AP staff to have the items necessary and to make that message clear and consistent with superiors, so that support can be provided to everyone? Because, looking through the policies and the procedures of WSU, there's language that says, okay, WSU cannot pay for A, B, and C during your telework, remote work. However, there is nothing in the policies and procedures regarding, but during a pandemic, this is what could possibly happen, right? But then there's also, WSU won't pay for certain things, but yet there's other ways that WSU can support staff, such as through cell phone stipends or hardware or necessary peripherals, or the tangible kind of items that can be purchased for your home workstation. But I think my much bigger concern is how can we make that message clear and consistent across the campuses and extension to continue providing, because extension provides so much work out to the individual communities, and so that's another whole situation there. But yeah, how can we make that message clear and consistent?
I think that we have to address that policy, as well as, I mean, to give you an honest answer, everybody's budget was reduced, and we just didn't have clarity around what we would be able to provide across the university. And so, to be honest, I think it was more or less left up to to budget managers to determine what they could do, and to go through the process of, can we allow this? And so what we need to do is identify the policy that would be okay to do that, but then also the funding source. And so how much can we use any emergency funding that we receive through federal and state? And I'm not saying that we can or we can't. The issue is there are many expenses, and so we have to be able to prioritize that. But I think what this situation has raised is we were not set up consistently across the university for people to work from home. So if that is something that we do plan to continue, we're going to have to be very intentional about a policy and a process for that. I think just going through okay, now you've got budget cuts. Now we don't know if it's going to get worse or better. Remember, we went through 6 months of there might not be more federal aid at all. We just didn't know. And we're facing that $60 to $80 million cut. I think that really is what happened in those months. But now we have this potential relief where we can say, well, maybe we can do some of this. Does that make sense? And we should for the longer term. Like I said, I think some of this is here to stay. How do we want to manage that? Now, I need to be careful here because not everybody's position long term may be conducive to that, to working from home or working from home some of the time. That's got to happen within your own units about what's going to work, for your operation. But I definitely agree. Looking at the policies, looking at that thing that used to not be allowed, right? This is going to be a new world issue, is that, yeah, it may not only be allowed, but if we look at the bigger picture of the expenses we might save by maybe being better able to utilize our current space versus build new space, now you're talking about something, kind of considering the holistic of the investment in that quote ability, the tools to work from home versus the investment of building new space, that's very impactful and needs to be included. In fact, even in our budget model that we're developing, it's talking about space. There are now space standards about how much space should, there be in an office or for a faculty, and then how do you manage that as a university? I don't want to get too far off on that, but it needs to be part of the budget process. And space is related to where people work on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Does that help a little bit without promises?
Of course. Yeah, no, thank you. I think my follow-up and suggestion would be, before I take up any more time on my questions, is to maybe bring this up to, the executive teams and, higher administration to continue having and maybe press on these conversations a little bit more, because if we continue in this pandemic, and I'm sure everybody's in the same boat, whereas the phases of vaccinations are very fluid right now, and we're talking some people are not getting vaccinated until the fall or winter. Another year of this it's going to put a strain even more so on individuals. So yeah, I think if those conversations can be brought on and continued with, that would be super helpful. Thank you so much, Stacy.
And I do appreciate that input. I think that's very important. Let's see, I'm looking through the chat, and I appreciate the comment on being able to, well, let me talk about that furlough. Yes, we definitely considered furlough coming into the year. Many of your colleagues in the auxiliaries have been on furlough. And in many cases, positions have been cut because auxiliaries are self-supporting entities. We worked mightily to avoid job loss and furloughs as much as we could. And I appreciate the comment about that, because it has been very difficult. And there's going to be people on this call and say, hey, I know I had colleagues who lost their jobs. It's true, like I said, but we did really, really try to focus our emergency funds and the actions that we took on the budget to say, well, you know, let's just try to hold on, let's try to get through this and try not to do that. There has been in the governor's budget, he put in there requirement over the biennium of 1 furlough day per month per employee. Obviously, that hasn't been through the legislation. Really, really hard to do furloughs at universities, right? You don't want to detract at all from faculty teaching classes and, you know, helping students and that type of thing. So I don't know if that will come to be, but I know that WSU is committed to doing what we can to keep our people employed. I mean, that has been the highest priority, which means maybe that some of these other things didn't get addressed like they could. But I do think that what we're trying to say is, especially the use of the federal funds, is how do we just get through the year? You know, we can have some type of loss, right? You know, we lived through deficits before. We could manage, you know, some. We just can't manage, you know, multiple years of that. So we have to focus on the recovery and do it in the right way. But I think the commitment to doing it and trying to retain jobs, I mean, the meetings I'm in, that's very, very, very clear that was a top priority. So we're going to continue to try to do that. But obviously, we've got other things we need to address. And I see not a single policy, but one tailored to the differences in how groups operate. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Extension is where few people have to do everything, right?
And I think we have a question from Sophia as well.
Yes, thank you. So my question is actually, I don't know if everyone has read the One WSU white paper and the follow-up to it, and we're talking about new budget models. Reading through this very critically and trying to compare, I'm in a very diverse unit. We basically have faculty and members in almost in every campus on state or in the state. And I'm wondering, how is that connected to the budget impact? Is it going to make it, I don't know if there's been discussion of, is it going to make it really a one WSU system, or are we going to be a little bit more divided in the way we operate with our budgets and the way we can offer courses? Our program's interdisciplinary. Folks can teach. Our students can have advisors on the Vancouver and the Tri-Cities campus, as well as in Pullman. And that's probably our strength. That is really, in our SWOT analysis, was one of our highly rated strengths for the school. And I'm wondering if there's been discussion of how we can integrate budgets. So we're given more, it sounds like we're given more control of budgets to campuses, and increasing administrative costs for the university overall, which really, in a time where we're doing a budget crunch, and we've heard from others that cost of living increases have not been consistent with the inflation rates. We've heard about the increased expense because of the pandemic, not just to the university, but also to individuals. I mean, I'm in the same boat where we've had to increase our internet capacity. And I've actually had to help out some of our staff to be able to perform their job without any interruption of service to students and faculty. And now we're faced with a new challenge of, we're going to have to adapt to a new budget model, one WSU system, which actually was not very clear. So maybe clarification would be great on that. And I guess I went a roundabout way of saying, how are the two correlated? When you're talking about a new budget model, we have a new workday system that's supposed to make it easier for us to work together and to see a lot more transparency in our system as far as budgeting goes. And then we have a one WSU, but reading it, it seems like it's going to add a little bit more layers to how we budget and how we work together.
Those are very good questions. And we're not far enough along really to give great clarity to that, but let me address a few things. The one WSU system was really intended to say to our students and our alumni and our partners and to our faculty and staff, we are one. When you get a degree from Washington State University, regardless of what campus, you're part of Washington State University, but it's also to acknowledge the world has changed, and we're trying to delve into being one WSU, like you mentioned on the workday system. It's very efficient to have one system, right, that everybody operates from. But how do you have more control? Our campuses are very different from each other, our extensions. So we're actually saying what we're talking about right now is, can you give greater independence to campuses and programs to, quote, operate their budget, but do so in a way that, is beneficial to the system as a whole? And I would tell you, I'm not sure we've answered it yet, but that's why we want to put these white papers out there. You notice they're drafts. I mean, the thing you should be happy about, I think, is the transparency, even though sometimes it's like scary to read because, what are they thinking? But we're also asking, what are you thinking? The white papers are being put out there very publicly as drafts saying, what do you think about this? What should we consider? How can we operate better as a system? And I will address the, you said administrative layers. If there's more independence, then you're going to need more people. Well, we were hoping really that modern systems like Workday says, well, no, you can operate off the same system, but now you're going to have access to, more data over time. I know it's very painful right now. We are truly in the valley of despair for any of you who participated in this sessions with Workday. It will get better over time. I mean, remember, this is a 40-year change, right? That we went from the system that we had for 40 years to the cloud, which is a pretty amazing jump in technology. But that's a tool that can help a system be a system. We're saying, well, if you have all this data, then why not give greater independence, if you will, to campuses and to operations? But then how do we do so in a collaborative manner? Because one of the criticisms of our current system is too much internal competition. That if we compete with each other internally versus with the external world, we're not helping ourselves. So how do we build a budget model that says, you colleges and campuses will be rewarded for collaboration? Many of you have seen it work very well in your areas. Some of you have heard the complaints, well, we can't do that program because the budget model doesn't support it. That should never be a right answer. I can't exercise this great idea because the budget model won't support it. There's a real problem with that. We need a budget model that says it encourages that faculty work together with chancellors, other campuses, administrative units to say, I've got this great idea for this program. Here's the business model. This is how it will work. That we have some central funds and that deans and chancellors have funds that they can, quote, invest, right, in a new program, and then that we can measure the success. The other thing we don't do very well here at WSU is ever stop doing things. And sometimes not every idea pans out, right? Sometimes if you stop something that isn't working, you can reallocate those resources to something new. And that's what modern budget models do, is they consider that not just that you get new money, but also you may gain new funds from reallocation. And the way I've seen that work the best is when that money can stay within, so that say that college is rewarded, the dean can lead oh, look, we have this money, so now we can use this for this new program or to, fund these types of activities. So it's trying to be holistic, but it's also trying to say, where now can we grant that greater, independence, if you will, because we can see, our finances all roll up to one place. We can see what's going on, but, do we necessarily have to, quote, call the shots from Pullman? And speaking of system structure, one thing that we're pretty committed to is we don't need a new system office. All of the vice presidents are being asked to say, what is your system role? Clarify your system role. I'm the chief financial officer, so I'm over budget and finance. We do the financial statements as one, we roll everything up. So I have a system role. I also have some operations that have a Pullman campus specific role, facilities, custodial, that type of thing. But they also have a system role in that all planning for all buildings across all of the campuses go up through that process. So we're each being asked to kind of go through and identify that. None of us are going to I'm not going to, become a new system vice president. I will have, probably the same title as my colleagues, but we're saying, what is your role? And we don't need a new system office. We're fine where we are. There is a focus to say, to make this equitable, does Pullman need to be treated as a campus like the other campuses? And so when you see that, you might think more administrative structure, but surely there's someone who can take on, that Pullman campus chancellor. It doesn't necessarily have to be a new position. Obviously, you have to think through, what does that look like? How does it work? But we're pretty committed to saying, what we need to try to avoid is growth in a lot of administrative infrastructure. And so we don't have an answer for that yet, but we're trying to establish those principles and then say, so can this work? Can we do it this way? And so it is trying to give some flexibility to campuses and colleges, but still keep them within the system.
Perfect. Thanks, Stacy. So with that, is there a discussion to adjust the enrollment-based funding model? That has actually created a lot of internal competition between, for example, myself and Biosystems Engineering Department, or our department in Vet Med. We should all be working together to recruit the best students and try to give them the best experience and send them out as Cougs into the world. And I felt since the day I started at WSU that the enrollment-based funding model has created a lot of unnecessary competition that actually prohibited our ability to offer specialized courses for our upper division and graduate students to really help them in their field.
Yes, and that is certainly what I've heard. And that's what I meant by we keep adding things versus just looking at our budget model holistically. And EBB just didn't consider some things. And so the example I would give you is, if not implemented properly, sometimes enrollment-based budgeting, incentive-based budgeting will create internal competition, because people say, hey, I know how to get these students. I'll start offering English and engineering or English. And so you've got to protect the core courses. It's a U core for all programs, and not create the ability for competition. And so I think you're saying what we had heard is it's creating unnecessary internal competition. And I think that I'm not saying that it wasn't, was a bad idea. It was probably a good idea. It was how it was implemented. And again, piled on top of these other special deals and things. So to me, it's a reset. For if you're going to have an incentive-based budget, you've got to be really clear about what you're going to incentivize. And what I mean by that is, usually you make the investment and you're expecting a return. Well, you and who else? Are you covering all the costs? And then is there an additional reward in that model for collaboration? Those types of things. So that budget model can drive that behavior.
Great, thank you. That sounds amazing.
I'm hoping so. I'm hoping it will get there.
Yeah.
It's complicated, but it's also fascinating to think about, how do we want to do this? And like I said, we should never accept that comment. Well, we can't do it because of the budget model.
Absolutely.
That's a problem.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Stacy. We just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to say thank you for joining us and your presentation and the answers to all of our questions. We really appreciate it, and the transparency. With that, any last minute questions or comments from anyone? Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Stacy. And
Thank
I
you.
hope that everyone has a great day and on to the next Zoom meeting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay well.